Whether you are a game developer already or aspiring to be a game developer, we all share the same story. At one point in your life, you were sitting in front of your favorite game, you were playing it for hours, and suddenly you had this idea of an amazing game that would be like your favorite game or games, and perhaps combine elements of them, or perhaps change the setting. So for example, from a sci-fi setting, you would have a medieval setting. But the point is, you accumulated some ideas and you want to create your game out of these ideas. But the problem is you don't know how, and making something that plays like your favorite games is a perfectly healthy motivation to have. However, this comes with a few misconceptions that you may have caught without even knowing it. So we're going to go through these misconceptions and I'm going to show you how games are actually made, and that will maximize your chances of successfully making your game. First, let's define success. For me, success is knowledge plus execution. So what do I mean by knowledge? Is that you actually know how games are made, you know all the pitfalls, all the things that you should and should not do, and as much as possible, you have minimized the amount of incorrect knowledge that you have. Then we have execution, because knowing something, knowing how to do something does not equal actually doing it. So execution is actually spending the time, the money, and the required resources to bring your ideas to life and see your project through to the finish line. So if you fail at making your game, it means that either you have improper knowledge, you lack knowledge, or you have poor execution. And most games fail just because they never see the finish line. So for us today, success means reaching that finish line. Now, when you reach the finish line, whether your game will sell or not, whether it will be downloaded or not, this is a different question. Now we're focusing on actually making the game. What's the proper knowledge that will allow you to successfully make that game, and how do you execute on that knowledge? Okay, so we need to start thinking like a pro. As I said in the beginning, the story that you started your game dev journey by playing games, by actually being a consumer of games, that's a great story. But one of the biggest misconceptions that come with this story is this. So this is the way you think games are made. So you may believe that to make a game like Doom, the dev team makes the first level, then they make the second level, then the third level, and same for the weapons. Perhaps they start with the machine gun, then the shotgun, then the other weapons, one after the other. And same for the enemies, they make the first enemy, then the second enemy, then the third one. And perhaps if they are a big team, they would do these things in parallel. So you have a team or a subset of the team making the levels, another one making the monsters, and another one making the weapons and items. This way of thinking in itself is not wrong, because a lot of projects in the world look like this. For example, to make a house, you make the basement, the foundation, then the walls, the ceiling, and you add the stairs, for example, and you make each story one on top of the other. That's a logical approach that works in real life. However, you have to understand that games are not pure science. If we had a clear formula for how to make a game, that would work, no problem. But games are a mix of art and science, and they involve a lot of human psychology with all the complexity that it entails. What we find fun and enjoyable can be both simple and very complex. So you'll have to do a lot of experimentation, a lot of testing and refining to find what works and what doesn't. So this linear approach doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because it's a high risk approach. So imagine you're making a platformer game, and when pressing the jump button, your character jumps a given distance, let's say 3 meters. Along the way, you realize that 3 meters is too much and you want to shorten the distance of the jump. So you shorten that distance. So from 3 meters, we are now down to 1 meter. But now the problem is some of your levels are completely useless. So if the character only jumps 1 meter in front of them, some of your levels will be impossible to win. So you'll have to do a lot of work, maybe redoing your levels in order to accommodate for this change. But more realistically, maybe along the way of doing these changes, maybe you lose motivation for the project, maybe you'll run out of time or out of money and you will give up. So we don't want this to happen. So maybe you will power through this and redo your levels anyway, but why take the risk? Why take such a high risk approach to making your game? There is a simpler approach and we're going to discover it right now. But to understand this approach, we need to understand what a game actually is. Have you ever asked yourself what a game is? So you know what a game is. It's something that's fun and enjoyable to play. Like you take your controller or your mouse and keyboard and you play that and you feel good while playing it. So that's fine. But from a game design perspective, we need to actually define what a game is. So in every game, you have a series of actions that the player repeats all throughout their playthrough. We also call these actions mechanics. So we're going to use the term mechanics from now on, but it simply means actions or maybe activities that your player does. And this loop of mechanics is called your core loop. Let's take, for example, games like Borderlands or Diablo. So in these games, the core loop consists of destroying enemies, collecting loot, then perhaps selling that loot, and then upgrading your gear. In games such as RimWorld or Dwarf Fortress, you build your colony, manage your resources, take care of the well-being of your colonists, and defend against threats, and then you repeat. In puzzle games such as the Talos Principle or Portal, you solve one puzzle, you unlock the door, and you go ahead to the next level to solve the next puzzle and unlock the next door, and so on. And remember that this is a simplified overview of what a core loop is, because in most games out there, the core loop is a bit more complicated than this. Each element or activity in the core loop can be itself another loop, and we can have loops within loops. For example, let's take Doom as an example, which is a great game, very simple in its design, yet so effective. So in the combat loop in Doom, you can have elements such as looking for ammunition, picking the best weapon depending on the situation, and using each weapon can be itself its own loop. So for example, you have weapons that have multiple firing modes that you can switch between in the middle of combat. So you can increase the complexity of each element in your loops. And you have to remember that you can only do this with experience. The more experience you have, the more you can be comfortable adding more complexity to your main loop. But if you lack experience, then you have to limit the amount of mechanics that your game has. So for example, in your main loop, you can limit it to like 3 or 4 elements and limit the amount of inner loops within each activity. If you don't do this, you may end up overscoping, which is a technical term for trying to add too many mechanics to your game, more than your team is capable of making. Remember, I said that success is knowledge plus execution. The fact that you know about some mechanics doesn't mean that you are able to execute them or that your team is able to execute them. If you cannot execute an idea, then that idea is worthless for you. And a lot of developers, they try to bite more than they can chew. A better strategy is to focus on the ideas that you have knowledge about or can acquire that knowledge through courses, tutorials, or by using ChatGPT, for example. And ideally, you should be able to also execute these ideas. This core loop is not the only set of mechanics that the player has at their disposal. The game can also have a story with missions or quests. You can have a crafting system, an economy system where you can buy and sell items. But all of these mechanics are just supporting the core loop. So we call these the supporting mechanics. An easy way to identify whether a mechanic is a core mechanic or a supporting mechanic is to ask yourself, if that mechanic was removed, will the game be complete without it? If the answer is yes, then that's a supporting mechanic. For example, let's take a game like Skyrim. In Skyrim, you have the possibility of having your own home. You can customize it and decorate it as much as you want. But if we were to remove that feature completely, will the game still stand on its own? So if the answer is yes, and in this case, yes, if we remove the possibility for the player to have their own home, then Skyrim is still a complete game. For example, if we remove the combat system altogether and turn Skyrim into a walking simulator, then that will be another game completely. It will not be the same game. So combat is a core mechanic in Skyrim. And you can do this as an exercise for all your favorite games. Take all the activities that you do in the game and ask yourself whether this activity is a core activity or a supporting activity. Okay, now we're able to define what a game is from a game design perspective. Now, whenever you think about a game, think of it in terms of mechanics. What are the core mechanics? What are the supporting mechanics? And how all of these mechanics are organized in loops. What differentiates good games from bad games is that good games have good game mechanics and they work well together inside their loops. And when we talk about loops, we are talking about a repetitive aspect inherent to all the games out there. So all the games out there, whether they're good games, bad games, they are all repetitive to some extent. The difference is that the good games mitigate that repetitiveness by having a really interesting core loop that can stand on its own. And sometimes it's enough to make a good game. But in most cases, these games add supporting mechanics and supporting loops that further mitigate that repetitive aspect. What makes a good game mechanic can be very complex, but I'm going to simplify it to two aspects. First, we have the feedback, and then we have the time scale of the mechanic. So what I mean by feedback is that when the player performs the action or does the activity, they should get something in return. They should know that something has happened. So the easiest way to do this is using sound effects, using music, particle systems, and all kinds of effects. However, feedback can also take the form of other game mechanics. For example, if I save a village in an RPG game, then the villagers will greet me with, "Oh, great savior," or something like that. So they will change their dialogue when they talk to me. And perhaps the local bartender can give me a discount because I'm this great hero. Or perhaps if I conquer an area, then now I have access to the resources on that area. I have access to the traders in that area and so on. So feedback can take a lot of forms, but the idea is that when the player performs an action, the game needs to have a clear and defined reaction. And the second aspect of what makes a good game mechanic is the time scale. Each mechanic in a game works on either the short term, the mid-term, or the long term. It's a good idea to have all your game mechanics in your game be distributed in terms of time scale. So you'll have a few mechanics or a few loops that work on the short term, a few loops that work on the mid-term, and other loops that work on the long term. So let's take a game like the Total War series, for example. So in the short term, I'm fighting the battle. I'm trying to win this particular battle. I'm trying to preserve the lives of my soldiers. So this is the short term. In the mid-term, perhaps I'm building some buildings in my settlements. I'm acquiring these items and doing diplomacy. But in the long term, I can conquer the world or I can conquer a continent. I have my short campaign objectives, my long campaign objectives. And in the mind of the player, it's great to have all these elements. So whenever the player does something, they do it to satisfy some short-term objectives, but also to satisfy mid and long-term objectives. If the game only has short-term objectives and mechanics that only serve these short-term objectives, then it will be lacking in some respect. On the opposite, if a game focuses more on the long-term objectives without taking care of the short-term stuff, then that game would be boring because you'll have to do a lot of work to get the rewards as a player, and that could be a bit frustrating. And talking about rewards, so the reward can be an aspect of the feedback of a game mechanic. So when the player does something, they get a reward in return. So all of these elements are interconnected and they work together to make your game a good experience. So now we have analyzed what makes a good game. Now when someone says, "Oh, that game feels good," or "That game is wonderful, I feel amazing when playing it," now you understand what they actually mean. how all the mechanics of the game create that experience, how they are all distributed in terms of time scale and distributed in such a way that the player always has some objective to pursue, and they know exactly, like if they do something, they know exactly what reward they should get in return. Okay, with all that said, what is your job as a game developer when starting to make your game? So your job is to find a good core loop and test it as fast as possible. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 years. We're talking about 1 or 2 weeks at most, or even a month if you are a beginner. The more time you spend on this, the greater your chance of failure. So in short, you need to test your crazy ideas as fast as possible. Perhaps you want to create a mix between Superhot, Doom, and Portal. So this is a novel and crazy idea. So you want to get to work on it. You want to test it as fast as possible. You want to implement it as crudely as possible. Don't think about fancy graphics. Use whatever you have at hand. Perhaps use an asset pack. And if you don't have access to asset packs, then you can just use cubes, cylinders, and stuff like that. So the goal is to actually make all the mechanics that you thought about and test them together to see if it works or not, and if the project is worth investing further resources into. So at the end of your prototyping phase, let's say 2 weeks, then you will decide whether it's worth it to continue on this project or give up and find another idea. Okay, so how do you come up with game mechanics? It's simple. You steal from other games. All the good games do it. So Nintendo, when they made The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, they did not invent the concept of an open world game. They took aspects from Skyrim, from other successful open world games, and they made their own. Try to have familiarity in your game. So for example, like 70% of your game mechanics should be familiar, should be something that people are used to, and perhaps in the 30% of game mechanics, then you can innovate, you can create some novel game mechanics or game mechanics that only have been used in some obscure games. And this is very important. When people play your game, they should feel a sense of familiarity while at the same time experiencing a little bit of novelty. The more your game is novel, the more you take the risk that players will find your game weird or hard to play, hard to understand, and that could be a death sentence for your game. So keep that in mind. Okay, so you can take mechanics from other games, you can combine them, you can come up with your own mechanics, but all of this is not worth much until you test your mechanics. So during your testing period, let's say 2 weeks, you will know whether your mechanics work or not, but also you will know whether you, and by you I also mean your team if you have a team, you'll discover whether you are able to execute these ideas or not, and this could be a great feedback. So at the end of the 2 weeks, then perhaps you can decide to scale down on your original design and perhaps only tackle a small subset of mechanics, and that's fine. It's better to work on something that you have control over rather than a big project that gets out of hand. And I'm not saying that this is easy. It could take you years of making prototypes before you find something that's worth pursuing, but it's much better than working using the linear approach on one game for like 3 years, and at the end of that 3 years, discovering that the game is not as fun as you imagined, or perhaps you delude yourself into thinking that it's very fun, but when you put it in the hands of other people, you discover that it's not as good as you think it is. So our goal is to mitigate all of these risks. Okay, now at the end of your prototyping phase, if you decide that this is a project that's worth investing more resources into, then you would gradually improve on each mechanic and each loop over and over again using the same principles that you used in the first prototype. So you take one mechanic, for example, the combat, then you add more feedback to the mechanics, for example, more sound effects, more visual effects. Perhaps you have some ideas about weapons. Then you prototype these ideas, you come up with a prototype, and if these ideas are good, then you keep them. If they are not, then you scrape them. And the important aspect is that you iterate over each aspect of your game over and over again. And at each point, you have a playable game that you can put in the hand of other people. And this is an important aspect because if you want to show your game to other people or perhaps to influencers, then having a playable demo is much better than having just a bunch of ideas and an unfinished project. Okay, let's put all of this knowledge into practice, and I'm going to give you a real-world example of how you would approach making a game. Let's say you want to make that idea of having a portal gun in a game like Doom with the possibility of slowing down time. Okay, so what are the mechanics of the game? So we have exploration, we have levels to explore, and in this exploration, we can, of course, move around. We can jump. Then we have combat. In the combat, we can use the portal gun, and you could stop here. So a couple of these mechanics in your main loop is perfectly fine if you are a beginner game developer. Okay, so let's say this is our main loop. So we have exploration and combat. For combat, we have a portal gun. We also have traps like lava. And we also have enemies. So all of these are mechanics within the main mechanic, fighting enemies, using traps, using the portal gun. Okay, so now we'll give ourselves 2 weeks to test these ideas. So what we're going to do is we're going to use whatever game engine you're comfortable with. If it's Unity, if it's Unreal Engine, if it's CryEngine, use whatever you want. The important thing is that we need to produce something fast. We need to test if using a portal gun with enemies will work. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a level. So in your game engine, create a level as fast as possible. In Unity, you can do it with ProBuilder. You can even create a level in Blender and import it in your game engine. And remember what I said earlier about the jump distance in platformer games? So we need to make sure that this level has as many platforms and jumping scenarios as possible. So this level needs to represent all the levels or almost all the levels that are present in your game. And this is what's called the vertical slice. So you can think of it as a slice of a cake where you can see all the layers. We need to include as much as possible in this one level to test which jump distance is ideal and which other mechanics are fun and tweak their parameters. Okay, so now we need a player with an FPS camera. In most game engines, you can do this very easily. You even have official tutorials to teach you to do this. All we need from our player is to move around and be able to jump between platforms and reach places. That's really all we need to do. And as I said earlier, we need to implement this in the simplest way possible. No smoothing, no fancy animations, none of that. That will come later. Now we are moving as fast as possible towards our goal, which is to test whether our mechanics work well together. Next, we need a portal gun with the ability to open a red portal and a blue portal and have objects go into one side and come out the other. So this could be a challenging mechanic to implement. And again, we only need to do it in the most crude way possible. So no fancy graphics, do not go and model a portal gun. So we just need something very quick. So for the portal gun, we can simply have a cube. So we need some simple enemies. We need for the enemies to look at the player and follow them. I have a whole course here on the channel about how to make enemies, how to make them look at you, shoot at you, etc. But here I'm not going to do all of that. We just need some simple enemies that will wait around, and when the player is within a certain radius, they will follow the player around. Okay, so when they follow the player, then we can use our portal gun. Next, we'll need traps. So I'm going to have a cube and give it an orange material. So I'm going to use this as a placeholder for lava. And I'm going to have the enemies come at me. And then I can open a portal on top of the lava. And then another portal on the ground, so that the enemy falls into the portal and falls out of the other portal into the lava. Okay, so this prototype, we can make it in like a week or even shorter if you have more experience. And we can already test whether our idea works or not, whether it's fun or not. So here we can add a few more traps. You can come up with ideas for more traps. You can test the movement. Perhaps the player can use movement and jumping to activate some traps in an innovative way. So you throw all your ideas in here, you implement them as fast as possible with all the tricks in the book. And the more you have experience, the more you can implement stuff very quickly without going too much into the details of polishing, etc. And at the end of the week or at the end of the 2 weeks, then you have a playable prototype that you can test. And here you can decide, is this something fun that I can implement? Perhaps later I can work on 100 levels for this. Is this a viable idea? If the answer is yes, then you would work on this idea. So earlier I said that one of the misconceptions was the linear approach. So the linear approach looks something like this. So perhaps you'll spend a month just implementing a portal gun, then another month implementing the movements of the FPS character, then the third month implementing like one enemy or something, then you would make a few levels after that. So this is too slow. With our approach, what we can do is have our prototype. So this prototype, we made it in a couple of weeks. It has most of the mechanics that we want in our game. We've tested a lot of scenarios regarding level design in just one level with all the elements combined. Now we can spread out. So this approach looks more like a spiral. So each of these lines, let's say it represents a feature of the game or a set of mechanics. So for example, this is combat, and this is the portal gun, and these are enemies, and these are traps. So I highlighted the dev cycle with the green line. So the green line represents what we actually do in the project. So first, perhaps we're going to improve the enemies, then we're going to improve the traps just a little bit, and then we'll improve the player, then we'll improve the combat, then perhaps the gun, etc. And every time we improve one feature or one mechanic just a little bit, just enough to see some visual progress, and then we move on to the next area. And this ensures that everything you add to the game can be tested together. And as we did at the end of our first prototype, we're going to evaluate whether the things that we added are coherent to the final experience or not. And then we can decide whether to keep these additions or not. So you only work on the actual content, which is like the models, the music, the sound effects, etc. You only work on that when the spiral has reached a certain point. So at that point, the project is more or less mature. So you can safely add these elements. You can safely invest. Perhaps you can hire a musician or an artist to make musics and models for you. And you can start working on the levels. Perhaps you want to add some story elements and supporting mechanics at this stage. But this is a much safer approach because you've already validated your idea. You already have a strong core loop, and everything you add on top of it is only going to make your game more interesting and better. So in the spiral, at any point, you can stop and decide that this is the final version of your game, or perhaps not even the final version. Perhaps it's the version that you're going to launch in early access. And that's it. That's really the gist of how games are made professionally. Now, all you need is a bit of experience. So if you find this too hard, start by making smaller games, and especially make sure that you finish the games and that you publish them somewhere, perhaps on itch.io. You need to publish games. Even if 1 or 2 people play those games, it will be an incredibly enriching experience, because the mindset that you get after publishing games is completely different from the mindset that you may have while fiddling with Unity or Unreal Engine and with no game under your belt. Make sure to get this experience. It's very important, and good luck. If you like this video and the content on this channel, then you can head over to the Ko-fi page of the channel. For as little as $5 a month, you can keep this channel going strong and help me produce more content and deliver much more value to you guys. So form the phalanx, defend the line, and thank you so much for your support.